Good afternoon. So, what's your story in Brisbane? My name's Tim. I'm from Seattle, Washington, USA. I'm going to share a story with you today, but before I do, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. I was an investigator for 20 years. 17 of it, I was in human trafficking and child sex slavery operations on and off U.S. soil. A lot of the stories that I tell are my way of dealing with complex post-traumatic stress. I've learned that if I can share my stories and I can utter the words and I can speak from my heart, that it sheds light in otherwise very dark closets in my mind. I was actually very excited to hear about y'all down there in Australia. So What's Your Story approached me and asked if I would share a little bit of my world with you, in the hopes that maybe I might draw a little bit more attention even down in good old Australia with regards to human trafficking and child sex slavery. It happens everywhere. It is not immune to any continent, any country, any city. It happens everywhere. The story I want to share with you is one I recently shared with another audience here in Seattle. It's one of my 12 defined traumas. So I'm just going to jump right into it. It's a little awkward for me to be doing a video into my phone. However, I'll do my very best for you, I promise. It was in the very early 90s, prior to the world becoming a global village via the internet. Most of the casework that I did was child pornography. Very often, by the time I received a case, it had already made its rounds through local law enforcement or local to the area that it occurred. I was fortunately, I don't know how you would want to perceive it, but I was delegated to reviewing evidentiary material. That's one of the things that I would do to determine additional witnesses, ideas, places, locations, victims, anything I could glean from these videos that we were able to obtain, and they weren't pleasant. In this particular case, the biological father had occasional visitation, and he'd opted to visit and not return the children, ending up in what's called a custodial kidnap. By the time I received the case, it was approaching about a year, I believe. By the time I would finally make contact with the kids, they were 7 and 9 approximately. My partner and myself often did the necessary reconnaissance work, surveillance work. We would get sufficient information or ideas of where we think the person may or may not be. We go into those areas and we do a surveillance and try to identify the subject we're looking for. Even better, find the kids and get them rescued and back home or wherever safety might be found. In this case, it was in the southwest U.S. The biological father had assaulted law enforcement personnel in my state and escaped with the children. It was quite a big deal, actually. So he'd shown a very high propensity for violence. The initial case material that we got was alarming because we had determined that the biological father was renting the children out at parties and then filming that and then selling the porn. Double dipping, as it were. It's always heart-wrenching to go through this material, and it's numbing in a way. I think a normal person's heart and mind will try to shut down when you're reviewing these things. But there was lots of good information that was located, and we had a very strong confidence that we had the right city and even neighborhood that we could locate this person. My partner Jared and I worked flawlessly together. We were, for all intents and purposes, may as well have been a married couple. Funny thing is, and you can't really tell by looking at me in a video, I'm 6'3", 300 pounds, very light-skinned Scottish man. My partner Jared was almost 6'7", approaching 350 pounds, and a very dark-skinned black man, raised Southern Baptist. And he was so black, we used to joke back and forth between each other that he was blurple. And needless to say, if you weren't ready to see the two of us enter a room, it could be quite an experience, especially if we boot in a door and suddenly we're there. We sat on the house that we had whittled everything down to. We sat on the house for a number of days, got used to the routine, never saw the children, saw some people come and go. Finally, once we felt very confident with the routine that had been established, we waited till late in the evening, or actually early AM, early morning hours, after all the lights had been off and no apparent activity had occurred inside the house for a number of hours. Jared and I decided we were going to make entry, and we were going to get a hold of the subject, get the kids, and get this case wiped off the desk. I wasn't prepared to see what we saw. Despite our size, Jared and I could be quite nimble and quite quiet. We did our standard quiet stealth entry. We carefully, methodically cleared our way back to the back two bedrooms. The first room is where we found our subject and the biological daughter. And this is where it starts to get a little weird and a little hard. The subject, the male subject, the biological father, was wearing women's panties, and next to him, his daughter, naked. She was surrounded by sex toys. Your mind will wander quickly to the weirdest and most unpleasant thoughts possible when you see a little 9-year-old girl surrounded by sex toys, two people there knocked out. More importantly, at that very moment, after shaking off the disgust and the surprise, I could see right next to the subject on his nightstand was a sidearm, a pistol. I felt a rage. I felt a rage like nothing I can explain, no vernacular does it justice. No explanation or effort to explain it is sufficient to tell you the amount of rage that I felt in my heart. I drew my sidearm and slowly pressed it up against the man's forehead. Woke him up, and I took a step back with my sidearm pointed right at his face. And I looked over to his sidearm, his gun, and I looked at him, and I holstered my sidearm. Basically, I was inviting him to go ahead and see if he could outmove me. I wanted to shoot him in the face. I wanted to end this piece of shit's life. He had no right to live. He had no right to continue living. And in that myriad of angry, livid thought processes, I felt Jared's huge hand on my shoulder. And he whispered to me, "She's been through enough. She's been through enough." What Jared was telling me, what should have been present in my mind the whole time, everything she's been through, what she doesn't need to see is a human being shot in the face right next to her. We secured the subject. It got him involved in the chain of custody with local law enforcement, where he would eventually be plumbed into the prison system. And eventually he would die in prison. I secured the two kids, the boy and the girl. The girl was 9, the boy was 7. And I went to a local diner to sit with them and get them something to eat. Super early breakfast, basically. While the state's equivalent of Child Protective Services swung into action, made contact with the mother, arranged transportation back home to Washington State. I hadn't had my own child by this point, so I was a little lacking in the parental guidance skills. Invited them to get whatever they wanted. Chicken nuggets and ice cream, what was ordered. Seemed harmless enough to me at the time. Now that I'm a dad, I probably wouldn't have ordered chicken nuggets and ice cream at like 4:30 in the morning. The little boy was seemingly oblivious to the world around him. He seemed honestly happy. The big sister, the little girl, you could tell she was hardwired to be his guardian, his protector, the person that looked out for him. She took care of making sure he had a nap and make sure that he had everything he needed with his chicken nuggets. Even encouraged him to eat some nuggets before he had an ice cream. I tried to make small talk the best that I could. We were worlds apart in our life experiences, so it's surprisingly difficult to make conversation with someone who you have no idea how they've survived what they survived. The little girl at one point asked me, what is next? What's happening next? And I explained to her very basically that there were people making contact with their mom. Their mom missed them very much, and it had taken us a while to find them, and we were going to get them home. She asked how they would get home, and I told her that we probably would get them a flight home. And she said, well, who's going to take us? And I said, well, I don't know for sure, but someone from this state, someone from here will at least get you to the airport, and the flight attendants will take great care of you on the plane and get you home to your mom. And the little girl looked at me and she said, well, why can't you take me? Take us, rather. And I explained that I had more casework to do and other kids to help, but that she would be in good hands. She said, am I not pretty enough? Am I not pretty enough? I couldn't fathom initially what the heck that meant. I said, well, you're beautiful, honey. I'm not really sure what that has to do with anything. Well, am I not pretty enough that you won't take us? Will you take us home? We feel safe with you. And I expressed to her that I was flattered that she felt safe with us, with me. But, again, I had things to do. And she looked at me with the facial expression of a 35-year-old adult. I'll give you any sex you want. Anal, whatever. A 9-year-old girl looked at me and offered me any sex I wanted, including anal. There's nothing on this life plan that anyone has that prepares you for a moment like that. I honestly felt nauseous. I looked at her and I said, honey, this is not how the world is. This is not how things need to be. I told her that she was a precious little angel and that sex had nothing to do with anything. And that's not what my role in this life is. I wanted to help her and protect her and see good for her. That's what her mother wanted. That's what all the people that were springing into action wanted. That this no longer needed to be an avenue that she would return to. Try having that conversation with a 9-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, a sitting next to her eating ice cream and chicken nuggets and not even really being present. She offered me a blowjob under the table. I will give you a blowjob right now under the table if you want one. And again, I expressed to her, no, that's not how life is, and that's not how life should be. I found myself explaining to her at the age of 9 that someone at the age of 9 shouldn't even be considering sexual exploitation. Never would really come to terms with the fact that anything I said made even the slightest bit of sense to her. I've never been able to get the visual of her on that bed with all those sex toys and related items laying around her on that bed. I've certainly never come to terms with the fact that a 9-year-old was prepared to have sex with me because she felt that's all she had to offer. Her and her brother did make it home to their mother. Things were dicey for quite some time. The little boy is now in prison all these years later, and eventually she killed herself. She got into drugs and prostitution, and then she killed herself. I would never and will never give up trying if I come across a victim of sexual exploitation like that. But I know in my heart that the likelihood of repairing or even shoring up a person's soul after that experience isn't good. I have removed 3 girls from sex slavery operations off U.S. soil and got them to U.S. soil. And each one of them eventually killed themselves. One was an OD, but I consider that suicide nonetheless. Human trafficking is a real thing. Child sex slavery is a real thing. Whether it's local, late teens working the streets, to kids as young as 4 years old being purchased by wealthy men so they can have sex with a 4-year-old. This happens. I spent most of my time in Southeast Asia, and that was predominantly under the age of 10. I spent some amount of time in Central and South America, and those were generally very early teens, and then Eastern Europe, which was later teens. I still feel great discomfort when I tell this story. But it's important that everyone listening to this story, that everyone hearing this story understands human trafficking is a thing, and human trafficking is something that we can't end, but we all contribute. If we all contribute, and if we all make an effort, we can make it extremely difficult for these people to do their thing. That's my story for today. I hope to bring you more. So what's your story in Brisbane? Thank you for listening. Be well.